Chapter 34. I had been back for almost 5 hours when a weary scruffling sounded at the loose plank, and my sad, bedraggled, and extremely smelly master tumbled back into the library, leaving a trail of what I hoped was mud in his wake. He limped his way like some giant land snail up the stairs to the first-floor room, where he promptly collapsed against a wall. Out of a spirit of scientific curiosity, I lit a small flame and inspected him closely. It's a good job I've had experience dealing with Stygian implants and the like, because he wasn't a pretty sight. He seemed to have been taken bodily and rolled through a particularly pungent mire or stable yard before being stirred headfirst into a vat of dirt and grass cuttings. His hair stuck up like a porcupine's rump. His jeans were torn and bloodied at the knee. He had a large bruise on his cheek and a nasty cut above one ear. Best of all, though, his eyes were furious. "Had a good evening, sir," I said. "Fire," he snarled. "Make me a fire. I'm freezing." This haughty master mode sounded a little out of place coming from something a jackal would have spurned, but I didn't object. I was finding it all too amusing. So I gathered sundry bits of wood, got a reviving fire going, then settled down, in Ptolemy's form, as close as I could stomach. "Well," I said cheerily, "this makes a pleasant change. Usually it's the genie who comes in worn out and covered in muck. I approve of such innovations. What made you leave the library? Did Lovelace's forces find you? Did your boar break in?" He spoke slowly through clenched teeth. "I went to get a newspaper." This was getting better and better. I shook my head regretfully. "You should leave such a dangerous assignment to people better qualified. Next time, ask an old granny or a toddler." "Shut up!" His eyes blazed. "It was that paper boy and his friend Fred. 2 commoners. They stole my disc, the one I made, and lured me away from here. I followed them and they tried to kill me. Would have done it too if it wasn't for the girl." "The girl? What girl?" "But even so, they smashed my head open and fell in a puddle, and then when they gone, I couldn't find the way back, and it was after curfew, and the search spheres were out, and I had to keep hiding as they passed. In the end, I found a stream under a bridge and lay there in the mud for ages while the lights patrolled up and down the road above. And then, when they'd gone, I still had to find my way back. It took hours, and I hurt my knee." Well, it wasn't exactly Shakespeare, but it was the best bedtime story I'd heard in a long time. It quite cheered me up. "They're part of the resistance," he went on, staring into the fire. "I'm sure of it. They're going to sell my disc. Give it to the same people who attacked Parliament. He clenched his fists. "Why weren't you there to help me? I could have caught them, forced them to tell me about their leader." "If you recall," I remarked coldly, "I was off on a mission you gave me. Who was this girl you mentioned?" "I don't know. I only saw her for a second. She was in charge of them. One day, though, I'll find her and make her pay." "I thought you said she stopped them killing you." "She still took my disc. She's a thief and a traitor." Whatever else the girl was, she sounded very familiar. A thought struck me. "How did they know you had the disc? Did you show it to them?" "No. Do you think I'm stupid?" "That's beside the point. Are you sure you didn't bring it out when you were fumbling for change?" "No! The paperboy just
knew somehow, like he was a genie or imp. Interesting.
It sounded exactly like the same bunch who had jumped me the night I had the Amulet of Samarkand. My girl and her cronies hadn't needed to see the amulet to know I had it on me either. And they'd later found me hidden behind my concealment spell. Useful abilities, which were evidently being put to good use. If they were part of this resistance movement, it sounded like opposition to the magicians was more developed and potentially formidable than I'd thought. Times were moving on in London. I didn't share these thoughts with the boy. He was the enemy, after all, and the last thing magicians need are my clever insights.
Leaving your misfortunes to one side for a moment,
I said.
Perhaps you wish to hear my report?
He grunted.
You found Heddleham Hall? I did, and if you choose, I can get you there. Beside the Thames is a railway heading south, over the river and out of London. But first, I should tell you about the defenses Lovelace has rigged up around his girlfriend's house. They are formidable. Airborne foliates patrol the surrounding countryside, while higher-ranking entities materialize at random on the ground. There are at least 2 protective domes over the estate itself, which also change position. I was unable to get beyond the boundary on my foray, and it will be even harder to succeed with a deadbeat like you in tow.
He didn't rise to the bait. He was too tired.
However,
I continued,
I can feel in my essence that they are hiding something at the hall. These defenses are in place 2 days too early, which involves a colossal expenditure of power. That implies mischief going on. How long will it take to get there? We can reach the edge of the estate by nightfall, if we catch an early morning train. There's a long walk at the other end, but we'll need to get going now. Very well.
He began to get up, squelching and oozing as he did so.
Are you sure about this plan?
I said.
I could take you to the docks instead. There's bound to be vacancies for cabin boys there. It's a hard life, but a good one. Think of all that salty air.
There was no answer. He was on his way out. I gave a sigh, snuffed out the fire, and followed him. The route I selected was a strip of wasteland that ran south and east between the factories and warehouses, following a narrow tributary of the Thames. Although the stream itself was meager, it meandered excessively across its mini floodplain, creating a maze of hummocks, marshes, and little pools that took us the rest of the night to negotiate. Our shoes sank into mud and water, sharp reeds spiked our legs and hands, and insects whined occasionally about our heads. The boy, by contrast, whined pretty much continually. After his adventures with the Resistance, he was in a very bad temper.
It's worse for me than it is for you,
I snapped after a particularly petulant outburst.
I could have flown this in 5 minutes, but oh no, I have to keep you company. Writhing about in mud and slime is your birthright, human, not mine. I can't see where I'm putting my feet, he said. Create some light, can't you? Yes, if you want to attract the attention of night-flying Jean. The streets are well watched, as you've already discovered. And don't forget, Lovelace may still be seeking us too. The only reason I've chosen this way is because it's so dark and unpleasant.
He did not seem greatly comforted by this. Nevertheless, his protest ceased. As we stumbled on, I considered our situation with my usual impeccable logic. It had been 6 days since the kid had summoned me. 6 days of discomfort building up inside my essence, and no immediate end in sight. The kid. Where did he rate in my list of all-time human lows? He wasn't the worst master I had endured, but he presented some peculiar problems of his own. All sensible magicians, well versed in clever cruelty, know when the time is right to fight. They risk themselves and their servants comparatively rarely, but the kid hadn't a clue. He had been overwhelmed by a disaster brought about by his own meddling, and his reaction was to lunge back at his enemy like a wounded snake. Whatever his original grudge against Lovelace, his previous discretion had now been replaced by desperation powered by grief. Simple things like self-preservation were disregarded in his pride and fury. He was going to his death, which would have been fine, except he was taking me along for the ride. I had no solution to this. I was bound to my master. All I could do was try to keep him alive. By dawn, we had followed the waste strip down from North London almost to the Thames. Here, the stream widened briefly before sluicing over a series of weirs into the main river. It was time to rejoin the roads. We climbed a bank to a wire fence, in which I burned a discreet hole, stepped through it, and came out on a cobbled street. The political heart of the city was on our right, the Tower District on our left. The Thames stretched ahead. Curfew was safely over, but there was no one yet about.
Right,
I said, halting.
the station is close by. Before we go there, we need to solve a problem, which is to stop you looking and smelling like a swineherd.
The various fluids of the wasteland adhered to him in a complex spatter pattern. He could have been framed and hung on a fashionable wall. He frowned.
Yes, clean me up first. There must be a way. There is.
Perhaps I shouldn't have seized him and dunked him in the river. The Thames isn't that much cleaner than the quagmire we'd waded through. Still, it washed off the worst of the clag. After a minute of vigorous dousing, I allowed him to come up, water spouting through his nostrils. He made a gurgling sound that was hard to identify. I had a stab, though.
Again? You are thorough.
Another good rinsing made him look as good as new. I propped him up in the shadows of a concrete embankment and dried his clothes out with discreet use of a flame. Oddly, his temper had not improved with the smell, but you can't have everything. With this matter resolved, we set off and arrived at the railway station in time to catch the first train of the morning south. I stole 2 tickets from the kiosk, and while sundry attendants were busy combing the platforms for a red-faced clergywoman with a plausible manner, settled back into my seat just as the train got underway. Nathaniel sat in a different part of the carriage, rather pointedly, I thought. His improvised makeover still seemed to rankle with him. The first part of the journey out of the city was thus the quietest and least troublesome half-hour I had enjoyed since first being summoned. The train pottered along at an arthritic pace through the never-ending outskirts of London, a dispiriting, jumbled wilderness of brick that looked like moraine left by a giant glacier. We passed a succession of run-down factories and concrete lots run to waste. Beyond them stretched narrow terraced streets with chimney smoke rising here and there. Once, high up against the bright, colorless cloud that hid the sun, I saw a troop of Jean heading west. Even at that distance, it was possible to pick out the light glinting on their breastplates. Few people got on or off the train. I relaxed. Jean don't doze, but I did the equivalent, drifting back through the centuries and contemplating some of my happier moments, magician's errors, my choice acts of revenge. This reverie was finally shattered by the boy throwing himself down on the seat opposite.
I suppose we better plan something,
he said sulkily.
How can we get through the defenses? With randomly shifting domes and sentries in place?
I said.
There's no way we can break in unmolested. We'll need some kind of a Trojan horse.
He looked blank.
You know, something which seems innocent, which they allow in past the gates, in which we're hiding. Honestly, what do they teach you magicians nowadays? So, we need to conceal ourselves in something,
He grunted.
Any ideas? Nope.
Scowling, he mulled it over. You could almost hear the fleshy innards of his brain straining.
The guests will arrive tomorrow,
He mused.
They have to let them in, so there's bound to be a steady stream of traffic getting through the gates. Perhaps we can hitch a ride in someone's car?
Perhaps, I said.
But all the magicians will be cloaked to the eyeballs with protective shields and bug-eyed imps. We'd be hard pushed to sneak anywhere near them without being spotted. What about servants?
He said.
They must get in somehow.
Give him credit. He'd had an idea.
Most of them will be on site already,
I said.
But you're right. Some may arrive on the day. Also, there are bound to be deliveries of fresh food, and maybe entertainers will come. Musicians or jugglers.
He looked scornful.
Jugglers? Who's got more experience of magicians, you or me? There are always jugglers, but the point is that there will be some non-magical outsiders entering the manor. So if we get ourselves into position early enough, we might well get a chance to sneak a ride with someone. It's worth a try. Now, in the meantime, you should sleep. There's a long walk ahead of us when we get to the station.
His eyelids looked as if they were made of lead. For once, he didn't argue. I've seen glaciers cover ground more quickly than that train, so in the end, he got a pretty decent kip. But finally, we arrived at the station closest to Heddleham Hall. I shook my master awake, and we tumbled out of the carriage onto a platform that was being speedily reclaimed by the force of nature. Several varieties of grass grew up through the concrete, while an enterprising bindweed had colonized the walls and roof of the ramshackle waiting room. Birds nested under the rusty lamps. There was no ticket office, no sign of human life. The train limped off as if it was going to die under a hedge. Across the track, a white gate led straight onto an unmetalled road. Fields stretched away on all sides. I perked up. It felt good to be free of the city's malignant clutches and surrounded by the natural contours of the trees and crops.
We followed the road,
I said.
The hall is at least 9 miles away, so we don't have to be on our guard yet. What's the matter now?
The boy was looking quite pale and unsettled.
It's nothing, just... I'm not used to so much space. I can't see any houses. No houses is good. It means no people, no magicians. It makes me feel strange. It's so quiet.
Made sense. He'd never been out of the city before now. Never even been in a big park, most likely. The emptiness terrified him. I crossed the track and opened the gate.
There's a village beyond those trees. You can get food there and cuddle up to some buildings.
It took my master some time to lose his jitters. It was almost as if he expected the empty fields or winter bushes to rise like enemies and fall on him, and his head turned constantly against surprise attack. He quaked at every bird call. Conversely, I stayed relaxed for this first part of the journey, precisely because the countryside seemed wholly deserted. There was no magical activity of any description, even in the distant skies. When we reached the village, we raided its solitary grocery store and pinched sufficient supplies to keep the boy's stomach happy for the rest of the day. It was a smallish place, a few cottages clustered around a ruined church, not nearly large enough to have its own resident magician. The few humans we saw ambled around quietly, without so much as an imp in tow. My master was very dismissive of them.
Don't they realize how vulnerable they are?
He sniffed as we passed the final cottage.
They've got no defenses. Any magical attack and they'd be helpless. Perhaps that's not high on their list of priorities,
I suggested.
There are other things to worry about. Making a living, for example. Not that you'll have been taught anything about that. Oh, no?
He said.
To be a magician is the greatest calling. Our skills and sacrifices hold the country together, and those fools should be grateful we're there. Grateful for people like Lovelace? Grateful for people like Lovelace, you mean?
He frowned at this, but did not answer. It was mid-afternoon before we ran into danger. The first thing my master knew about it was me throwing myself upon him and bundling us into a shallow ditch beside the road. I pressed him low against the earth, a little harder than necessary. He had a mouthful of mud.
What are you doing? Keep your voice down. A patrol's flying up ahead. North-south.
I indicated a gap in the hedge. A small flock of starlings could be seen drifting far off from the clouds. He spat, his mouth empty.
I can't make them out. On plains 5 onward, they're foliates. Trust me. We have to go carefully from now on.
The starlings vanished to the south. Cautiously, I got to my feet and scanned the horizon. A little way ahead, a straggling band of trees marked the beginning of an area of woodland.
We better get off the road,
I said.
It's too exposed here. After nightfall, we can get closer to the house.
With infinite caution, we squeezed through a gap in the hedge and, after rounding the perimeter of the field beyond, gained the relative safety of the trees. Nothing threatened on any plain. The wood was negotiated without incident. Soon afterwards, we crouched on its far fringes, surveying the land ahead. Before us, the ground fell away slightly, and we had a clear view over the autumn fields, heavily plowed and purple-brown. About a mile distant, the fields ran themselves out against an old brick boundary wall, much weathered and tumble-down. This, and a low, dark bunching of pine trees behind it, marked the edge of the Heddleham estate. A red dome was visible, on the 5th plane, soaring up from the pines. As I watched, it disappeared. A moment later, another bluish dome materialized on the 6th plane, somewhat further off. Hunched within the trees was the suggestion of a tall arch, perhaps the official entrance to the manor's grounds. From this arch, a road extended, straight as a javelin thrust between the fields, until it reached a crossroads next to a clump of oak trees, half a mile from where we stood. The lane that we had recently been following also terminated at this crossroads. 2 other routes led away from it elsewhere. The sun had not quite disappeared behind the trees, and the boy squinted against its glare.
Is that a sentry?
He pointed to a distant stump, halfway to the crossroads. Something unclear rested upon it, perhaps a motionless black figure.
Yes,
I said.
Another's just materialized at the edge of the triangular field. Oh, the first one's gone. I told you, they're randomly materializing. We can't predict where they'll appear. Do you see that dome? No? Your lenses are worse than useless.
The boy cursed.
What do you expect? I don't have your sight, demon. Where is it? Coarse language will get you nowhere. I'm not telling. Don't be ridiculous. I need to know. This demon's not saying. Where is it? Careful where you stamp your feet. You've trodden in something. Just tell me! I've been meaning to mention this for some time. I don't like being called a demon. Got that?
He took a deep breath.
Fine. Just so you know. All right. I'm a genie. Yes, all right. Where's the dome? It's in the wood, on the 6th plane now, but it'll shift position soon. They've made it difficult for us. Yes, that's what defenses do.
His face was gray with weariness, but still set and determined.
Well, the objective's clear. The gateway is bound to mark the official entrance to the estate, the only hole in the protective domes. That's where they'll check the people's identities and passes. If we can get beyond it, we'll have got inside. Ready to be trussed up and killed, I said. Hurrah! The question, he continued, is how we get in.
He sat for a long time, shading his eyes with his hand, watching as the sun sank behind the trees and the fields were swathed in cold green shadow. At irregular intervals, sentries came and went without a trace. We were too far away to smell the sulfur. A distant sound drew our attention back to the roads. Along the one that led to the horizon, something that from a mile away looked like a black matchbox came roaring. A magician's car, speeding between the hedges, honking its horn imperiously at every corner. It reached the crossroads, slowed to a halt, and, safely assured that nothing was coming, turned right along the road to heddle him. As it approached the gateway, 2 of the sentries bounded towards it at great speed across the darkened fields, robes fluttering behind them like tattered rags. Once they reached the hedges bordering the road, they went no closer, but kept pace beside the car, which presently drew near to the gateway in the trees. The shadows here were very thick, and it was hard to glimpse what happened. The car pulled up in front of the gate. Something approached it. The sentries hung back at the lip of the trees. Presently, the car proceeded on its way, through the arch and out of sight. Its drone faded on the evening air. The sentries flitted back into the fields. The boy sat back and stretched his arms.
Well,
He said,
that tells us what we need to do.